The sky over the village of Tsüngremmung darkened as the last embers of the sun melted behind the misty hills. Tsüngremmung sat by the fire outside her thatched home, her fingers tracing idle patterns in the dust. She was no longer a child, yet the weight of loneliness pressed against her, as if she were one. Since her mother's passing, her father, Tsupalai, had changed. His voice had lost its warmth. His hands had forgotten the tenderness of a father's touch. The arrival of her stepmother had only widened the chasm between them. The woman never raised a hand against her, but her cruelty lay in the way she twisted Tsupalai's heart. Words, softer than silk yet sharper than a blade, dripped like venom from her lips. "She is cursed," she would whisper, feigning concern. "Misfortune clings to her like a shadow. Have you not seen how the crops fail? How sickness follows her steps?" At first her father resisted, but doubt, once planted, took root. The villagers, too, began to murmur. Strange accidents and whispered superstitions turned their gazes cold, their kindness brittle. Tsüngremmung noticed the shift, but she bore it in silence. It was a lesson she had learned well. Silence was a shield. One morning, as the mist curled through the trees, Tsupalai took her hand. "Come," he said, his voice steady but devoid of emotion. "We must gather firewood." It was the first time in months that he had sought her company. Hope, fragile yet insistent, flickered in her chest. She followed him eagerly, her bare feet pressing into the damp earth as they ventured deeper into the forest. The towering trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches whispering secrets to the wind. She did not notice when the familiar paths disappeared behind them. They reached a clearing where the ground gaped open, a pit, dark and yawning, as though the earth itself had decided to swallow the light. Tsüngremmung turned to ask her father why they had come here, but before her words could form, hands pushed against her back. The world spun. A scream tore from her throat, swallowed instantly by the dense jungle. The fall was not long, but it was cruel. Her body struck the dirt floor, the impact stealing the breath from her lungs. Pain flared through her limbs as she scrambled upright, her eyes searching the rim of the pit. Above, the silhouette of her father stood against the pale sky. "Father!" Her voice wavered, disbelieving. "Help me up." Tsupalai's expression was unreadable, but his silence was more damning than any words he could have spoken. He turned away, his retreating footsteps muffled by the forest floor. Tsüngremmung's heart pounded in her chest. This was not a mistake, not a cruel trick. He had left her here. Panic surged through her veins. She clawed at the dirt walls, her nails filling with earth as she tried to climb. The loose soil crumbled beneath her fingers, sending her sliding back down. Again and again, she tried, her breath coming in ragged sobs, but the pit was deep, its walls offering no hold. The day faded into night, bringing with it a cold that seeped into her bones. The forest came alive with sounds, distant howls, the rustling of unseen creatures. Fear wrapped around her like a second skin. She curled into herself, pressing her forehead against her knees. A dull ache settled in her stomach, gnawing at her insides. Hunger and thirst would come next, but for now, it was the betrayal that hurt most. She thought of her mother, her soft voice, the scent of her hair, the way her laughter used to fill their home. If she were here, she would have held Tsüngremmung close and whispered that everything would be all right. But she was gone, and so, it seemed, was any love her father once held for her. Above her, the stars shone cold and indifferent. She was alone, abandoned in the belly of the earth, left to be forgotten. Yet, deep inside her, beneath the pain and despair, something stirred. A whisper of defiance. She would not die here. The night stretched endlessly, each passing moment tightening its grip on Tsüngremmung's trembling body. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and her throat felt parched, as if dust had settled deep within. Sleep was impossible. Each sound from the forest above sent shivers through her spine. The distant cries of unknown creatures, the rustling of leaves, the eerie silence that followed. Fear had settled into her like a second soul, but it was not enough to break her. By dawn, Her limbs ached from the cold, and exhaustion clung to her like a heavy shroud. Yet, the first streaks of light filtering into the pit ignited something within her, a renewed determination. She pressed her palms against the damp earth and tried once more to climb. Her fingers found shallow grips, her toes dug into the crumbling walls, but each attempt ended the same. Sliding back down, her body bruised, her hands scraped raw. Panting, she collapsed against the side of the pit, frustration burning in her chest. Was this her fate? To wither away in this grave dug by her own father's hands? No, she would not surrender. If the earth refused to yield, she would wait for an opportunity. It came unexpectedly. By midday, the sun burned high, casting slivers of golden light into her prison. Then a rustling sound. Tsüngremmung stiffened, her pulse quickening. Something moved above. A shadow loomed over the edge. She tensed, half expecting to see her father again, perhaps returning to ensure she had perished. But it was not him. A boy peered down, his face partially hidden by wild, unkempt hair. His eyes were sharp, curious. He could not have been much older than her, but there was something in his gaze that spoke of a life hardened by solitude. He said nothing, only stared, tilting his head as if assessing her worth. Tsüngremmung's breath caught. Help! She had to ask for help. Please, she croaked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Help me get out. The boy did not answer immediately. Instead, he sat at the edge, his legs dangling, watching her. Then, he reached into a small satchel slung over his shoulder and pulled out something, dried meat. He tossed it down. It landed in the dirt beside her. She hesitated, staring at the offering, unsure if it was a trick. But hunger won over caution. She snatched it up, chewing desperately. The meat was tough, salty, but to her empty stomach, it was salvation. Who are you? She asked between bites, her voice still hoarse. He did not answer. Instead, he rose and disappeared from the edge. Panic shot through her. Wait, she called, scrambling to her feet. Don't leave me here. Silence. She sank back, despair creeping in once more. Had he just come to watch her die? To feed her once before vanishing like some spirit of the forest? But as the sun dipped lower, he returned. This time, he carried a long, sturdy vine, its length coiled around his arm. He knotted it to the nearest tree and tossed the other end down. Hope surged into Tsüngremmung's chest. She grasped the vine, ignoring the sting in her raw palms, and pulled herself up. Her muscles screamed in protest, her arms trembling, but she refused to let go. Inch by inch, she climbed, the walls of the pit finally slipping behind her. When she reached the top, she collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping. The scent of damp leaves filled her lungs, a scent she had feared she would never breathe again. The boy watched her, silent as ever. Thank you, she managed between gulps of air. Still, he said nothing, but his lips twitched, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. Then, without a word, he turned and began walking into the trees. Tsüngremmung hesitated only for a moment before pushing herself up and following. She did not know where he would lead her, nor why he had chosen to help. But she knew one thing for certain. She would never look back. The forest stretched endlessly before them, an untamed world where every step felt both liberating and uncertain. Tsüngremmung followed the boy in silence, her mind a storm of questions. Who was he? Why had he saved her? Where is he leading her? Yet, she knew better than to push for answers too soon. They moved through dense foliage, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming wildflowers. The boy moved with ease, his bare feet barely making a sound against the undergrowth. Tsüngremmung struggled to keep up, her body still weak from days in the pit, but she refused to fall behind. As dusk settled, they reached a clearing where the remains of an old hut stood, a skeletal structure of rotting wood and creeping vines. The boy motioned for her to sit while he rummaged through a hidden stash of supplies, a clay pot, a bundle of dried herbs, and a small pouch of rice. You live here? She finally asked, breaking the silence. He nodded, but offered no further explanation. Instead, he handed her a wooden bowl filled with steaming rice. flavored with something earthy and unfamiliar. She ate quickly, the warmth filling the hollow ache inside her. The boy finally spoke. "Your father will look for you." His voice was rough, as though unused to conversation. The words sent a chill through Tsüngremmung. She knew he was right. Her father was not the kind of man who left loose ends. He had thrown her into that pit to die, and if he discovered she had survived, he would not rest until he corrected his mistake. "I won't let him find me," she said, her fingers tightening around the bowl. The boy studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Then you need to be stronger." The following days were unlike anything Tsüngremmung had known. The boy, whose name she learned was Edibin, was no ordinary outcast. He knew the ways of the land, how to move unseen, how to read the forest like a story written in roots and leaves. He taught her how to snare small animals, how to find edible plants, how to sharpen a blade from stone. She listened, she learned, and she hardened. Yet, no amount of training could erase the past. The nightmares still came, twisting her sleep into restless darkness. Each time, she woke with her father's voice ringing in her ears, the memory of his betrayal suffocating her like the walls of the pit. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, she turned to Edibin. "I can't live like this. Always running. Always hiding." He didn't answer, but she saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I need to face him." Her voice was steady now, free of fear. "I need to show him that he didn't break me." Edibin exhaled slowly. "Then we go back." The decision was made. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they set off toward the village she once called home. Every step brought her closer to the man who had cast her aside, yet she felt no fear, only purpose. By midday, the village came into sight, its familiar shapes almost foreign after all she had endured. The people turned to stare as she entered, their whispers curling around her like smoke. Shock, disbelief, fear. Then, her father emerged. His face darkened at the sight of her, his hands curling into fists. "You should be dead," he hissed, stepping forward. Tsüngremmung held her ground. "But I'm not." Her voice cut through the air like a blade. "You tried to bury me, but I climbed out. You left me to die, but I lived. And now, I'm stronger than you ever imagined." The silence was deafening. Her father's eyes flicked to Edibin, assessing him, then back to her. He saw the change, the fire in her gaze, the steel in her spine. And for the first time, she saw something in him she had never expected. Doubt. He could not touch her now, not when the entire village watched, not when she had returned, not as a broken girl, but as something else entirely. She turned away before he could speak, before he could reclaim power over her with his words. She had no need for his explanations, his justifications, or his regrets. She had chosen her own path, and she would never look back.